You know, the man who effectively designed America's public school system absolutely did not send his own kids there. His name was John D. Rockefeller. Back in 1917, when his grandchildren reached school age, he didn't put them in the sprawling public school system his immense wealth was funding all across the country. No way. Instead, he just built them their own private setup, a school in Manhattan called the Lincoln School. It had small classes, incredible teachers, and the real kicker, the kids there were actually allowed to think for themselves. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the stark reality of how the American education system was systematically built to churn out obedient workers. But we're also diving into how one incredibly brilliant mind managed to slip right through its grasp. We're going to break down the blueprint of this massive machine, and then we'll get into the fascinating story of Richard Feynman's great escape.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this. It's 1906, and a former Baptist preacher named Frederick T. Gates, who happens to be Rockefeller's right-hand man, pens this rather chilling memo from an office paid for by Standard Oil. He literally writes, "In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand." I mean, just let that word sink in for a second, docility. He goes right on to say, point blank, that they shouldn't try to make these people, or their kids, into philosophers, men of learning, or scientists. They weren't out to raise authors, artists, statesmen, or even lawyers and doctors. The system was deliberately designed straight from the top down to strip away independent thought and mold a perfectly obedient working class.
Now, you might be thinking this was some top-secret conspiracy, right? Nope, this philosophy was right out there in the open. It was plainly published in a 1913 pamphlet called The Country School of Tomorrow. Honestly, it's just been sitting there on a shelf in the Library of Congress for over a century, and almost nobody read it. Sure, some historians will try to tell you Gates was only talking about rural kids, but the memo is crystal clear. It says these people or any of their children. And get this, Rockefeller was about to fund the construction of 912 public high schools across 11 different American states. That pamphlet, it was the foundational philosophy for those very schools. It was a calculated, deliberate plan to control the destiny of working-class American kids.
To really wrap your head around the scale of this, you got to look at this number. 28 billion. That is the sheer Goliath-like financial muscle behind this whole operation. The General Education Board, run by Gates on Rockefeller's behalf, pumped $325 million into American education over a 60-year period. If you adjust that for today's money, you're looking at roughly $28 billion. So, from 1896 to 1920, the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations combined actually spent more money building the American compulsory school system than the United States federal government did. Think about that. Two guys sitting on oil and steel monopolies literally outspent a democracy to engineer the classrooms its citizens would learn in. This wasn't charity, folks. This was social engineering on a massive industrial scale.
And you know what the wildest part of this whole thing is? People actually saw it happening in real time. They tried to sound the alarm. In 1915, the National Education Association, the teachers' union itself, passed a formal resolution warning everyone that these private, totally unaccountable foundations were quietly pulling the strings on state education policy. Just 2 years later, in 1917, Senator Chamberlain of Oregon stands up on the Senate floor and flat out warns that in just 2 generations, Rockefeller and Carnegie could rewire the minds of the people to conform to their corporate cults instead of fundamental American democracy. Fast forward 36 years, and the Congressional Reece Committee concludes that these foundations were financing practices that were literally incompatible with our Constitution. A teachers' union, a sitting U.S. senator, and a formal congressional committee. They all spoke up, and guess what? They were completely ignored.
Now, here's a fascinating little twist. Rockefeller and Gates didn't actually invent this cage. They imported it. Way back in the early 1800s, after Napoleon steamrolled the Prussian army, the Prussian state decided to build a school system with one very specific goal: to pump out soldiers who follow orders blindly and workers who wouldn't dare think sideways. Then, in the 1830s, a guy named Horace Mann brings that exact model across the Atlantic to Massachusetts. By 1918, a Harvard professor named Alexander Inglis publishes Principles of Secondary Education. And honestly, this thing was effectively the instruction manual for American obedience. It took this post-Napoleonic military barracks model and morphed it into a Harvard-endorsed blueprint for the entire country.
And this brilliantly illustrates what that blueprint actually looked like in practice: the factory classroom. Just look at these clinical features. You've got bells ringing to signal movement between tasks. You've got seating locked into rigid rows. You've got permanent grades stamping kids as either good or broken.
Obviously, these are not natural ways for humans to learn. They are calculated clinical mechanisms designed for one thing and one thing only: obedience and managing giant crowds of people. I mean, literally every bell a student hears today, every rigid row they sit in, it's a direct relic of a foreign military barracks rented out to American children just to enforce conformity.
But right around the exact same time that Harvard professor was publishing his shiny new manual on how to make children obey, a quiet little working-class rebellion was brewing. The year is 1918, down in Queens, New York. We've got this immigrant uniform salesman from Minsk named Melville Feynman holding his newborn son, Richard. Now, Melville had always dreamed of being a doctor, but his family just didn't have the money for it. So what does he do? He essentially builds a medical school of sorts at his kitchen table, with his baby boy as the single enrolled student. Melville had no idea about Gates's chilling memo. He didn't know what the General Education Board was. But sitting there in Queens, he was unknowingly preparing his son to completely break this massive systemic trap.
The contrast here is just completely stark. On one side, you have the billionaire's systemic, calculated plan. You've got Frederick Gates literally writing down that the goal is to teach children to perfectly repeat whatever imperfect things their parents were doing. No philosophy, no questioning, just blind, efficient repetition. But then, on the other side, you've got this immigrant father's kitchen table philosophy. Melville Feynman told his son the exact opposite. He told Richard to completely forget what his parents did. He taught him to look at the world directly, to ask what things actually are, and to totally ignore what people merely called them.
Which brings us to this absolutely legendary story Feynman used to tell about taking a walk in the Catskills with his dad. They run into another kid who points at a bird and basically sneers at Richard because he didn't know its name. The kid mocks him, saying, "Your father doesn't teach you anything." Well, Richard goes and tells his dad, and Melville drops this absolute masterclass of a lesson on him. He says, "See that bird? It has a different name in every language. When you have learned every one of those names, you will still know absolutely nothing about the bird. You will only know something about people, what they call the bird. Now, let's look at the bird." I just love that. Gates wanted a nation that could blindly recite. But Melville, he raised a boy who could actually see.
Now, because Melville literally sold uniforms for a living, he had this incredibly grounded, practical insight into authority. He knew firsthand that a uniform is literally just a piece of cloth. The guy wearing it is just a guy. A police badge doesn't magically make an officer correct, and a fancy professor's title doesn't inherently make their knowledge the absolute truth. He drilled into Richard that authority symbols are just fabric and brass. They do not guarantee correctness. And let me tell you, that specific lesson armored Richard against an entire educational system that was heavily designed to make him blindly bow to rank.
And oh boy, did that system try its hardest to process him. Richard ran into an absolute gauntlet of filters thrown at him by the Rockefeller-funded machine. First up, the IQ test. He scored a 125, which the system decided was merely average or respectable. Next, his high school flat out refused to offer calculus to working-class kids. And then, when he applied to Columbia University, which, by the way, was a heavily Rockefeller-funded institution, they rejected him outright because their Jewish quota was already full. The system was doing exactly what Gates designed it to do: identify the ordinary, certify the ordinary, and process them right on through. It used a ruler that completely failed to measure a mind destined for a Nobel Prize. They had absolutely no mechanism to realize that Far Rockaway High School was harboring 3 future Nobel laureates at the very same time, completely writing Richard off as nothing special.
But Richard wasn't going to let that stop him. He found a bypass. Because his high school had decided calculus was just way too advanced for working-class families, the folks Gates dismissively referred to as rural folk, Richard went out and found a cheap, self-taught paperback. And the title of this book says it all: Calculus for the Practical Man. The author, J.E. Thompson, quietly published this thing to tell everyday hardworking people that they had been lied to. He wanted them to know that advanced math was absolutely not out of their reach. So Richard took this cheap paperback and he copied every single page by hand into a notebook. And the craziest part, that exact notebook still exists today in the archives.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what Richard did next. Remember, the system had officially rated him average and essentially told him to just move along. But behind the scenes, Richard was quietly rebuilding mathematics itself. When the standard symbols for sine and cosine started confusing him and slowing down his thought process, he didn't just obediently accept them. No way. He invented completely new mathematical symbols in his notebook just so his brain could process the equations faster. The school filter was only calibrated to measure obedience, so it had absolutely zero idea that this kid had taught himself every single branch of high school and first-year college math by the time he was 15. He ended up entering the New York University Mathematics Championship and completely dominated the competition, scoring vastly higher than anyone else in the room. Which leads us to this incredibly cynical twist of fate. Let's call it the 1942 irony. All of those heavily layered filters, the IQ tests, the report cards, the rigid admissions quotas at Columbia, they all did their job and dropped him out. But then World War II hits, and suddenly the country realizes that perfectly obedient, docile workers cannot figure out how to build an atomic bomb. So, the exact same massive, heavily funded institutions that tried so hard to filter Richard out, they had to quietly backtrack and desperately rely on the one brilliant escapee they missed. They absolutely needed the man who refused to conform.
For over 100 years, this system has sorted, ranked, and handed out little certificates telling brilliant people that they're just average, all while elevating the people who can simply recite the right words on command. Frederick Gates wrote the instruction manual for that system over a century ago, and honestly, it's still doing its job today. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative question to think about. The next time a credential beats a thinker in a meeting, what did the thinker have that the prudential didn't? Just remember Melvin Feynman's ultimate liberating lesson. The uniform is just cloth. Forget the names, forget the titles, just look at the bird.